Welcome to this explainer on the Battle of Berlin. Today, we're diving right into the staggering scale and, frankly, the grim reality of the monumental clash that finally ended World War II in Europe. We're talking millions of soldiers, tens of thousands of artillery pieces, and the total devastation of one of Europe's largest capitals. It's a heavy subject, but getting a grip on the sheer magnitude of this final offensive is absolutely crucial for understanding the geopolitical landscape that came next. Let's get into it. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll cover the race to Berlin, how the Soviets were pushed back, a dire defense, into the rubble, the surrender and aftermath, and finally, the legacy we remember. Okay, part 1, the race to Berlin. So picture this. It's April 1945. The Western Allies have halted at the Elbe River, but Joseph Stalin is in a massive hurry to take the capital. Why? He needs that crucial post-war leverage. And man, the forces he brought were just staggering. The Soviet war machine mobilized an unbelievable 2.5 million troops, backing them up with over 6,200 tanks and more than 41,000 artillery pieces. Facing them, a cobbled-together German defense of roughly 766,000 exhausted troops in severely depleted divisions. It was a complete mismatch, an unstoppable force bearing down on a desperate, broken defense. Which brings us to part 2. The Soviets pushed back. Now, despite those overwhelming numbers on paper, the initial assault wasn't exactly a walk in the park for the Red Army. In fact, they were originally pushed back. The final offensive kicked off on April 16th at the Silo Heights. This was a critical, elevated position about 90 kilometers east of Berlin, looking right over the Oder River. German General Gotthard Heinrici, who was honestly a master of defensive tactics, correctly predicted the main Soviet thrust and heavily fortified these heights. So when Marshal Zhukov's forces attacked, they ran straight into a literal meat grinder. The Soviets were pushed back heavily, enduring a grueling 4-day slog that cost the Red Army roughly 30,000 lives and hundreds of tanks. It wasn't until April 19th that the sheer overwhelming weight of the Soviet numbers finally cracked that final defensive line, cracking open the gates to Berlin. Moving into Section 3, a dire defense. Once those gates were opened, the Red Army rapidly moved to encircle the city, and the situation inside became unspeakably dire for the Germans. I mean, who was actually left defending the capital? The garrison had roughly 45,000 desperate, exhausted, regular soldiers from shattered Heer and Waffen-SS divisions. To bulk up the numbers, they literally threw in the local Berlin police force, young boys from the Hitler Youth, and around 40,000 elderly men. They were staring down millions of seasoned, battle-hardened Soviet troops. The disparity is almost hard to wrap your head around. A crucial piece of this puzzle is the Volkssturm. This was the German home defense militia. Relying on them really highlights exactly how dire the situation was for the Germans at this point. We're talking about grandfathers here, men who had fought in the muddy trenches of World War I decades ago. Now they're being handed a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon and told to go stop columns of advancing Soviet T-34 tanks. It was a completely unwinnable combat scenario, laying bare the absolute desperation of a collapsing regime. And as if the surface combat wasn't horrific enough, things got even more dire for the millions of civilians trapped inside. In a fit of absolute scorched-earth fanaticism, Hitler issued the Nero Decree, ordering the destruction of the city's own infrastructure so it wouldn't fall to the enemy. Tragically, this led to the flooding of the S-Bahn and U-Bahn railway tunnels. Imagine the horror. Thousands of terrified civilians seeking shelter underground from the constant artillery fire suddenly met with rushing floodwaters. Many drowned right there in the dark. Part 4, into the rubble. With the outer defenses crushed by April 24th, we zoom right into the rubble-strewn streets for some incredibly claustrophobic house-to-house combat. On the morning of April 22nd, a Soviet battery commander gave the chilling command: open fire on the capital of fascist Germany. That signaled the start of a relentless, suffocating artillery bombardment. To put the sheer scale of this into perspective, over the course of the battle, Soviet artillery dropped a greater tonnage of ordnance onto Berlin than all of the Western Allied air raids on the city combined throughout the entire war. Just think about that. The city was systematically pounded into dust and shattered concrete before the infantry even stepped foot in the streets. The Soviet advance acted like a vice, quickly building a suffocating ring around the remaining defenders. They choked off the city center by pushing through converging axes, smashing their way from the southeast along Frankfurter Allee, pressing up from the south along Sonnenallee, and pushing down from the north. Every single city block, every ruined apartment building instantly became a fortress. It was savage, close quarters, room-to-room fighting in the ruins, with all these forces converging on one spot, the symbolic heart of Nazi Germany, the Reichstag. Now, here's a really fascinating historical footnote for you. We've all likely seen that iconic photograph, right? The Soviet soldier raising the red flag high over the ruined Reichstag. Well, while the building actually fell to the Red Army on May 2nd after some unbelievably fierce, bloody fighting, that specific photograph was actually a staged reenactment. A photographer snapped it the following day, on May 3rd. Yet it completely remains the defining global symbol of the total Soviet victory. Section 5. Surrender and Aftermath. Following Adolf Hitler's suicide in his underground bunker on April 30th, the will to fight finally broke. General Helmuth Weidling surrendered the garrison on May 2nd. But listen, the end of the fighting definitely didn't mean the end of the suffering. The aftermath for Berlin civilians was an absolute nightmare. The city was a smoldering wasteland. No functioning infrastructure, no clean water, no food. The starvation was so acute that desperate civilians were actually reduced to carving up the corpses of dead horses left in the streets just to get a little bit of meat. At the same time, as extensively documented by historians, the civilian population endured a horrific wave of rampant looting and mass assaults. These were mostly perpetrated by rear-echelon Soviet troops who arrived right after the frontline soldiers. 125,000. That's the estimated number of German civilian deaths during the entire Berlin operation. It's a staggering figure, isn't it? When we talk about military history, it's so easy to get lost in troop movements and tank numbers, but a figure like that forces us to pause. It really makes you reflect on the immense human suffering inflicted upon non-combatants who were just caught in the crossfire of this monumental clash. And the military toll was equally horrifying. The sheer scale of the slaughter on both sides illustrates exactly why this is remembered as one of the deadliest, most brutal battles of the entire European theater. The Soviet Union lost over 80,000 dead, with hundreds of thousands more wounded. On the other side, the German military dead are estimated between 92,000 and 100,000. When you add that all up, nearly 500,000 human beings lost their lives, their health, or their sanity in a matter of just a few bloody weeks. Which brings us to our final section, the legacy we remember. Today, more than 3/4 of a century later, the horrific physical scars of 1945 are largely hidden beneath the concrete and greenery of a reunited, vibrant, modern city. But the memory is absolutely still anchored in the landscape. If you visit Berlin today, right in the heart of the city, in the lush Tiergarten Park, you'll find the Soviet War Memorial. Built in 1945, almost immediately after the battle ended, it was constructed using gray and black marble salvaged directly from the ruins of Hitler's Chancellery building. Flanked by artillery pieces and T-34 tanks, it stands quietly as an eternal physical witness to history. Beneath the manicured lawns right behind the memorial lie the graves of over 2,000 fallen Red Army soldiers who fought their way all across Europe only to fall in the war's final days. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought as we wrap up this explainer. When we look back at the staggering price paid, the hundreds of thousands of soldiers lost, the 125,000 civilians killed, a historic city literally wiped off the map, how do we truly measure the cost of the final battle that ended the bloodiest conflict in human history? Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.